So my benchmarks for whether or not the Lake Ontario is doing well or not as the Lake Ontario Waterkeeper is it swimmable, is it drinkable, and is it fishable? Those aren't things I made up. Those are things I learned from people in the environmental movement, many of the mentors and people even in this room. We know that those are easy benchmarks to keep track of. And they're not sort of way out concepts. I like to think that if you have swimmable, drinkable, fishable water, you have strong democracies. You have transparency and justice and liberty in the community. You know what it's like to be free and to be equal. And those may sound like high words, but everywhere I go, their people have clean water. They also have strong governments and strong democratic processes. And when you lose them, I find that power, money, and influence dictate who gets the short end of the stick. And it's a sign that your democracies and your civil rights are corrupting. And I'm just going to give you one great example. This Toronto Harbour. I'm going to use it as my example here today. This water you're looking at is a sewer shed. It has 9 combined sewers that flow into this bed. As the condos went up in Toronto, and the investment went in Toronto to get us back to the waterfront, which, you know, some people oppose, but I think getting people back to the waterfront is a positive thing. They were all built on the CSOs. That meant that every time it rains in Toronto, those old sewers that are only separating the rain from the sewage, when it rains, they overflow. So all that sewage from those buildings are coming out in these 9 sewer sheds in this harbor. This harbor does not provide drinkable water to humans, obviously. There's no swimming allowed in this harbor, and it's not fishable. People still fish here, and there's a big fight to restore the right to go fishing here, but it's almost everywhere in this harbor, the restrictions on consumption of fish, and the Port Authority has a rule against fishing. Now, what does that have to do with democracy? Well, I look what happened recently with the airport. And I'll suggest this to you. The Shipping Act has taken away, these are all public lands. You look at the airport, public lands. There's 2 kilometers of beaches, public lands. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful public space in Toronto. As I said, the cleanest water in Toronto is right off those beaches. Toronto now gets part of its drinking water because we built a long pipeline off the point, off of Gibraltar Point, where it provides the deep water cooling to downtown Toronto and then is drinking water. And it comes from over 180 feet from the depths of the lake. There's drinking water, there's swimmable water, there's fishable water out there. We're completely cut off from an airport. And the debate is, there were rules. The Port Authority under the Shipping Act only represents the industrial users now, even though it's public. That law was changed in the mid-90s. But we have a contract, thankfully, between the province, the city, and the federal government, that if you're going to use these public lands, there's going to be conditions. The conditions were that it was going to remain a small airport. There weren't going to be jets allowed, and you weren't going to be allowed to build a bigger runway into the lake. That they want to change that. Fair enough. That's great. You can change that. Under the old laws, now the Waters Protection Act, Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, before the Shipping Act was removed, that would have meant there'd be another opportunity for everyone in this room to participate in a process to discuss what are the alternatives. Is it in the public interest? So do we want to expand the airport, or do we want that to be a park? Do we want those beaches? Do we want to rezone the use of those lands? But without those public processes, we have no right to even go in there and start to ask those questions. We're not able, on a body of water that is not swimmable, not drinkable, not fishable, and we don't have a democracy that allows us to go and ask questions about someone who's basically using our land, our public lands, through a lease and a contract, and they want to change it, and we don't have an opportunity to go there and say, well, look, you know, maybe expanding the runway and building a bigger airport in downtown Toronto is a good idea, but maybe it's a good idea to look at what else could be done with those lands. Maybe Toronto would be one of the great cities in the Great Lakes if within 10 minutes of its towers, you could run and go swimming. Maybe Toronto could really use those lands for other purposes and provide greater economic security, build a culture of respect in downtown Toronto that would last for generations. And ultimately, maybe we'd have swimmable, drinkable, fishable water again on Toronto's waterfront. And I like to think that, and I know this is maybe a stretch, and I'll finish here, but I do think that when we lose our respect for swimmable, drinkable, fishable water, when we no longer have water, all we can do is really look at that water, and it's beautiful, and I'm happy to be here this morning, but to think that it's not swimmable, drinkable, fishable usually also means that someone's stolen it from us, that we're no longer involved in making the decisions as to how that water is being used or what use will be made of it in the future, and we become disconnected from it. And it's a sad reflection for me, as someone who practiced law from the beginning, became a waterkeeper, and stands up and gives meaning and force to these laws, that a democracy, that our government won't provide us with the opportunity to intervene and stand up on behalf of the lake. So it's always a privilege to come before the Council of Canadians, because all of you are very interested in issues of depth, civic issues, issues of Canadians' rights, privatization, public assets, the public trust. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about these issues that I'd otherwise wouldn't talk about when it's just about environmental issues. But I do think that's how deep these issues run. If we don't have clean water, then we're also losing out on other areas of our democracy, including our right to fix and to clean our water in the future. So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity here this morning.